Okay, so hello everybody. I'm Ilhana, and today I'd like to welcome you to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to the Tell Me Your Story Reviews June 2021 project, during which we're essentially inviting stories on the Indian diaspora. The purpose of this review and this project is to investigate ambition based movement under our annual theme of migration, resettlement, and displacement. Today, we're honored to have with us Dr. Neilesh Bose and Sanchaiyata Majumdar. I'll begin by introducing both our guests today. Dr. Bose is an associate professor of history, and his interests include colonialism, decolonization, post colonial history, nationalism, literary history, and intellectual history. He earned his PhD in South Asian history at Tufts University and has taught at the University of North Texas as well as St. John's University in Queens before joining the University of Victoria in 2015 as a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History. He has also served as a visiting faculty member at Queens College of the City University of New York, as well as India's Ashoka University. Sanchaiyata Majumdar is currently working as an assistant professor of English at Garden City University, Bangalore. She completed her graduation from Bethune College, Kolkata, in English literature, and a post graduation in English literature from University of Calcutta. Apart from that, she has also, to her credit, an additional postgraduate diploma degree in print journalism. She nurtures her skills through extensive reading, online courses, paper publications, and presentations, which are all a source of great deal of passion for her. So, with that, Dr. Bose, actually, I'm going to address you as professor because I'm myself an undergraduate student. And I'm going to start with my first question. So, my first question for you today is that as a generation Canadian, second generation Indian in Canada, what has your experience been like with the Indian community in Vancouver?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and inclusion into this program and into this important initiative. And for the question, Ilhana, I would say that, first of all, I am located in Vancouver Island, which is an island off the coast of British Columbia. And the city of Vancouver is based in the mainland of British Columbia. And this is on an island, though the name is shared of Vancouver Island. Yet the city where I live is in Victoria. And this is also on top of the unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples and the Wasanich and Esquimalt peoples predate the rise of European settler colonialism. And I would say that in terms of the Indian communities here and in other regions where I have lived and worked throughout the United States and in various parts of Canada, including the place where I currently live, that here the local reflections and distinctions of migration patterns are very clear because the majority of Indian migrants to this region are from the province of the Punjab, in primarily in India, but also in Pakistani Punjab. And some members of this community have links and roots that go back to the late 19th century and can trace their families and their lives and works back to that time. And in some cases, back to the very important political moments in which the Ghadar Party, for example, was created, and a lot of political agitation around the question of Indian immigration occurred in this very region where I'm living. So some people do, but the density of and diversity of Indian migration and settlement is very different than it is in urban parts of North America, where I have spent comparatively more of my time in terms of teaching, research, and engaging with different parts of the Indian diaspora in North America. And though there are smaller pockets of communities, Bangladeshi as well as Bangla speaking people from India, as well as South Indian people, primarily Tamil speaking people in this region, whose migrations have been much more recent. There is much more of a trace of the Punjabi migrant experience and set of politics than there are in other parts of North America. So I would say that my experience, though has been very positive, has been from that vantage point compared to my experiences in other parts of North America, in Texas and in New York, where I forged very strong relationships with Bangla speaking communities from India and Bangladesh, as well as in New York in particular, communities of Indian migrants whose origins lie in the migrations via the Caribbean and indentured labor movements and mobilities, as well as a connectivity to the Indian Ocean. Whereas here, the bulk of the migrants that I have engaged with, immigrants as well as those of Indian origin, regardless of their reason for being here, have been through the Punjabi stream of migration. So that colors the way that I would exist in this space, and the way that this space is touched by migrations from India. And that's where I would that's where I'd stop this particular comment for now.
On to Sanchaita.
Yeah. Professor Bose, I was literally intrigued by your book, The South Asian Migrations in Global History, and particularly this chapter 3, wherein you speak of a case of the power of bargaining when it comes to indentured laborers and how it has been projected as having played a key role in global migration pattern. So I would just like to know, like, if this power of bargaining is really capable of implementing any migrant-oriented laws in any of the foreign countries.
Hmm. Yes, that is a very important issue. It is not an area of my own particular research right now, but I would say that as that one chapter suggests, the power of bargain led to, within the space of indenture, new legal provisions to be made for the accommodation of particular cultural practices regarding food and food preparation and consumption on the journeys, as well as created a venue for the recognition of migrant struggles within the context of indenture. Another separate but related issue is how the presence of migrants in different parts of the indentured labor diaspora informed the changes in marriage laws and in the recognition of marriages by Indian migrants in various parts of the world, not only in India. This was an issue that was not fully dealt with until there were large numbers of indentured laborers and their descendants in the Caribbean and in parts of Southern Africa, the Pacific, in Fiji in particular, and also quite visible to the British Empire in its metropolitan center in the early 20th century.
Great, thank you. Ilhana, you wanna go ahead?
Yes, of course. So, Professor, my next question for you is, there's a large part of the South Asian community that identifies as Desi, that thinks of themselves as Desi. So I wanted to know, do you think of yourself as Desi? And if yes, you do, what are some of the aspects of your Desi identity?
This is a good question, something I would have to think about. I would say that I accept that label if it is productive and generative in terms of um, building community outside of the local, the particular, the sectarian, the communitarian. At times, that label, being Deshi, can do this. And at times, I certainly do identify in that way. So, what does that mean? It means that both in terms of the work that I would do, in terms of research, and in terms of the teaching that I do wherever in the world, whether it is in diasporic location outside of South Asia, whether it is in South Asia, and for me, I have deep connections to both India and Bangladesh, and I do not define myself or situate myself vis-a-vis any one religious community, any one nation state in the region. I do, however, have a commitment to the peoples of South Asia and its diasporas, wherever they may be. And so I feel that Deshi is a term that can accommodate that diversity. if it accommodates it, I am quite a proponent of it. There may be moments when that sort of an identitarian move may flatten out the specificities and the local particularities. But that depends on the context and on the layers in which one is engaging. But I'd say in general terms, yes, I do, out of a political commitment to seeing South Asia in a connected space outside of the kinds of divisions that may block us from seeing each other in zones of contact and zones of familiarity.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Sanchaita.
Professor, first of all, speaking from the academics point of view, I literally was surprised rather from your book Beyond Bollywood and Broadway. I'll tell you why. Because when we fix a curriculum, we normally don't look into plays when it comes to diaspora. But I found literally that book is a treasure for me right now. So you had mentioned this formation of Gadar Party in the introduction today. You mentioned Gadar Party. So I want to know, like, when it comes to Indian freedom movement or struggles, when children they read about it, or even when as adults we read about it, we do not really see the mention of sporadic, say I would call it diasporic political parties abroad who might have contributed when it comes to Indian freedom struggle. So, can you just tell me, like, is there politics behind it, not to project such sporadic movements, or what is it? Why don't we read about them when it comes to diasporic national movements that were happening outside of India?
Yes, so I'd say in that regard, there are many different factors that lead to the privileging and the centering of certain historical narratives, certain kinds of historical archives and individuals, and the neglect of others. I'd say that in most cases, whether we are speaking about India and Indian nationalism, or the history of the United States, the history of Canada, the history of Japan, um, most of the time, students and local audiences tend to lose interest when the historical actors are outside of a easily recognizable frame of reference. And so the Punjabi migrants, for example, primarily, there were not only Punjabi migrants, as one of my forthcoming works will explore. There were plenty of people from other parts of India who were significant to the Gadar Party, who spent significant time here in the Pacific Northwest and in parts of North America in the era of the Gadar Party. Not only Punjabi, but Punjabis were my majority. But here there is an interest in this local history, and I would say that it is a question of figuring out how to connect the local sources of inspiration and interest and investment into a narrative and a set of materials that can speak to people wherever they are. And so it is quite heartening to know that you read and found the anthology of plays useful, because I feel that was one of the goals of that project, because the plays show this very fact in many different angles. And this is something that is difficult for local audiences and histories to fully grapple with. I would say one last word on this point is that in various parts of the world, there are many different movements that seek to gather these stories, these points of inspiration, and to translate them for local audiences. And I'll give two examples. In South Africa, if we think of South Africa 100 years ago or 50 years ago, there would have been very little, if any, formal or academic or institutional interest in the histories of Indian people who had migrated to South Africa, who had contributed to the building of that society, and then whose families lived and stayed there, and whose further generations lived and stayed there. Today, in the 21st century, there are numerous activities and institutions that seek to implant versions of this history for all South Africans. And this is something that has been growing in the last generation. In the United States, there is an organization called the South Asian American Digital Archive, and they have been working on producing a collection of works aimed at students in primary, elementary, and high schools about these very historical moments, individuals, and political movements. And I have contributed to that project, and it will be visible and accessible in the near future. And I would say again, 50 years ago, this would have been impossible to imagine. And today, and for the future generations of our communities, it will be a vastly different world of what people can access and how they can imagine their histories.
Right. We'll certainly look forward to that, Professor. Ilhana, you may take it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So, Professor, my next question has more to do with the idea of home and what exactly, for what exactly the idea of home is for you. So, you mentioned that, you have really strong connections with both India and Bangladesh. And so, my next question is, given that you live abroad, you think of Bangladesh and India as home? And if yes, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I do, in the sense that everybody's conception of home is, I think, multiple, multifaceted, and variegated. There's not one place, there's not one set of practices or foods or family or anything like that. It is something that has so many different manifestations for any individual, I think, in the world. For me, I would say that the answer is yes. India and Bangladesh both are my home. But why is that? I'd say that there are several different reasons why. One is that I would situate myself, if I have to, though I have lived and worked and researched and taught in many different places, I would place myself within the ambit of my family, my parents, who are my first layer of my home. Wherever they live, wherever they are my first, in a sense, situatedness in a home, and they bring with them, and to me, a sense of, I would say, India at some level, but also a Bangla phone and Bangla Bengali culture, which is not to me located in a particular place or a territory or nation state. But when it comes also to India and Bangladesh, I spend time in these regions, and I will always spend time in these regions, either in my mind and in my own work and research and writing, or in terms of my body, because this is where I am most connected in terms of where I see myself in terms of how I can contribute to knowledge. And so that is why. It is not because there's anything, let's say, hardwired about this process. This is to some degree what I inherit, and it is also what I will always be committed to. And there would be parallels for people who both study, research, and teach about areas that they're connected to in Africa and the African diaspora. Is a similar context where there are people who are connected to that broad cultural landscape, historic landscape, which is so dense and so deep, but they may not live either in Africa or the African diaspora, but spend their entire lives within it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Professor, my question from my side would be the availability of citizenship in Western countries. You did mention about certain crude racial laws of insistence on whiteness as the key criteria to get citizenship in America back in the 1900s. So I would like to know your take on the current scenario, because not long back we witnessed a sharp revival of this not so direct but a very subtle prejudice against I would say not just Asians, but people of color by the American government during the tenure of Donald Trump in getting a US visa. In comparison to that, obviously, Canada was much more tolerant. So, what do you think? Like, if today I wish to migrate to the US, to America, due to my ambition, do you still think this whole idea of whiteness is very much important when it comes to getting a citizenship in the foreign Western soil?
Yes, thank you for that question and that the topic of discussion. I would say that there are many issues to discuss here. When it comes to the question of whiteness, which is a term that may be used in a variety of ways, I would say that vis-a-vis this discussion, when we think of citizenship and history, there are ways to link the particulars of exclusions of particular peoples to categories of racial difference in the past, which was the case in the early 20th century, in particular from the 1880s to the 1917 Bard-Zone Act, and a series of laws from the 1917 moment through the 1940s, where laws began to change. And from the mid 1960s, vis-a-vis the US at least, immigration laws begin to change radically in the sense that they are not directly linked to a conception of race. However, they do become linked to a relationship of nation state, because as opposed to racial difference, quotas by nation state emerge from the mid 1960s. And I just recently spoke about this in another forum. And I mentioned, and as I'll mention here today, from that moment through the present, there are generations of people who have been able to enter, again, not by racial qualification or distinction, but by nation state, from South Asia, and rising numbers of individuals who have been able to enter the country and to assimilate into the United States vis-a-vis citizenship, naturalized citizenship, and then their children would be by birthright citizenship U.S. citizens. Now, there are so many different types of ways to enter the United States, so it is very difficult to generalize on questions of racial difference or whiteness and the question of nation state in the present. But I would say that in the context of the administration of Donald Trump, which has recently is now gone into our past, though there were moments when the visa system started to change to disproportionately affect those in South Asia and other parts of the world, which it did in 2017, interestingly enough, a year's anniversary of the Bard-Zone Act. What perhaps is more pressing is the continuity of other ways of excluding other peoples from the borders of the United States, whereas there are exceptional moments in which certain visa applicants have been identified and to some degree singled out, and whose processes have been made much more difficult, 2017, 18, uh, which relate at times to education and to different types of visas vis-a-vis jobs. So one of the largest growing populations in the United States are those who would be seen as so-called undocumented and whose origins are in the region of South Asia. Also, at the same time, a large population that is growing are the populations of people who are born to parents in the United States of South Asian origin. And their citizenship struggles, these two groups, are vastly different. They are to some degree on different sides, different poles of these debates. For those coming from the outside, I would say that the changes are more changes in cosmetics and language. The continuities from the early and mid 20th century are more pressing. And for those who are interested in migrating, or who are migrating for a variety of purposes that do not flow from their own individual choices, these migrations are continuing, likely will continue, and there is no reason necessarily to think that they will subside or that they should subside.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I'll just continue my next question because it's again from the same book that I'm referring to from yours. So Islamophobia, I'm pretty sure even our audience are quite sure of it, is a Western fear of anything, everything, and anyone related to a particular community, Islam. So in your book, Culture and Power in South Asian Islam, defining the perpetual exception, you mentioned the complication of Islamicate, if I'm pronouncing it right, happens via a very non-canonical language, and specifically if you can just share your thoughts on if the intra-South Asian prejudice against a particular religion has a bigger role to play in Islamophobia in Western countries? I mean, does the intra complications and tendencies to marginalize one community make it really easy for the Western world to target this community in the global space?
Hmm. Thank you for that. That is an interesting, somewhat unexpected line of questioning, and that is interesting to discuss. I would say that again, like with the question of citizenship and migration, it is impossible to generalize, and we must always disaggregate, and we must always think of the local and the particular. When it comes to the context of Islamophobia, a term that has a certain valence in the Western world, as you implied, it has less in other parts of the world. But as we were discussing earlier, there is, there are pre-existing sources of prejudice, I would say, that get activated by particular moments in history. They are not essential to any group or individual or place, and they change. But there are moments, I would say, moments attached to the in the context of Bengal, the partition of the late 1940s, and what that wrought in terms of the changes of the region, the creation of refugees, as well as in the context of Islam, the perception that the state of Pakistan was an entity that was designed to oppress Hindus. And then the prejudices that develop around Islam outside of that particular lived space, I believe those are quite real, and they are quite significant, and they appear throughout the world. And so the short answer is that yes, there are some spaces and pockets and moments and triggers that generate prejudices, and then may be manipulated and exploited by those who seek to do so in the Western world, again removed from the context of the people who live through moments of great conflict and crisis that often generate these prejudices.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ilhana, you may take over.
Yeah, thank you. Professor, you briefly touched upon this at the beginning of our conversation, and I was hoping you could shed some more light on it. Given that you've worked and taught, you've lived and worked, sorry, in both the US and Canada, and I sort of wanted to know how your experience was, what your experience was like over there. As in, did you feel that um, in both places were people more welcoming, or did you face some sort of well, is there some sort of exclusion? I just wanted to know a little bit about that.
Yes, so thank you for those questions. I would say that rather than frame my own experiences, if I had to, as exclusion, I would say that there are pockets where migrants of South Asian origin and people who would be perceived to be South Asian would be more or less welcomed within a broader set of institutions and the broader public space. And there's a spectrum of that sort of feeling of welcome or feeling of recognition. For example, in this region here, there is not a very, there's not a vast population of migrants of South Asian origin, but that does not mean that there is any element of exclusion. But it's simply that there isn't the level and the density of a population that there is in New York, and that there is also in the North Texas region where I had lived and had worked. And I would say that in both of those regions, there was a much larger and much more diversified set of populations, which enabled a certain kind both of engagement intellectually, socially, in terms of cultural events and different things. So it is simply that it is the spectrum of the density population and not not a perception of exclusion.
Thank you for that. I have one last question for you. Your area of expertise include modern South Asian history from the 18th century to the present, colonial India, histories of religion, empire, nationalism, transnational history, global history, and decolonization. So I wanted to know whether your interest towards South Asian history stems from a sense of connection that you feel with the region.
Yes, thank you for that. I certainly do, but I would say that, like as I mentioned, with those in the context of the African diaspora and African history, as one, I don't feel that a connection with the region exhausts my relationship to it, but I do feel a connection to the region, and I am committed to the region, and I likely always will be committed to the region. But I have interests that are not, not in existence only because of that connection. They are simply the manifestation of my ability to intervene and to contribute to scholarly knowledge, but they are not defined only by that connection.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, Professor, just one last interest. It's not really a question. As a second generation Indian, there in Canada, specifically Bengali, we'll just touch upon that part. How easy or difficult it is to hold on to a Bangaliana, if I have to call
Jay,
in that
Jay.
term. And is it really necessary? Because I really want to know this. Is it really necessary to hold on to your Bangaliana, or it's fine? Like if you are just going by, since I believe you are there, you were born there, you were born and brought up there. So, is it necessary? Is there a pressure somewhere, maybe from your relatives, from your maybe the community there, that you hold on to something that is Indian?
Yes. So on that note, I would not say it's necessary. I would say that there are elements of food cultures and practices that I retain, anywhere in the world that where I may live. So fish is something that I consume everywhere in the world, and I go to great troubles to make sure that I can have mache jhol here or anywhere in the world, and mishti also. But I don't think it's necessary. It is simply something that happens to loom large in my own life. But I define it again not so much in terms of an abstract or essential culture. I just believe that every individual has some sort of connection to senses of life and wonder outside of their own individual existence and outside of only the life in the world. They have some kind of connection to the world of family and to the world outside of oneself. And Bangaliana can be that way. That is for me what it is. It could be something else. So it is not required in my view.
Thank you so much, Professor. Ilhana, do you have any more questions?
No more questions.
Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of today's conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Bose, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be part of the Stories of Indian Diaspora series of TMYS review for June 2021. I'm pretty sure our audience enjoyed this insightful conversation that we just had. So with that, I'll take my leave, and thank you once again. Hope to connect in the future. Thank you so
Thank you.
much, Ilhana, for moderating the session as well. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.